Our speaker today is Drew Johnson, who is a PhD candidate in the philosophy department. He received his BA from Grinnell and his MA from Northern Illinois. He's been the recipient of the UConn Philosophy Department's Ruth Millikan Award, and he's presented his research at the American Philosophical Association and many other conferences. He's published on topics like skepticism, deep disagreement, and with Dorit are on self-knowledge. And he is going to be talking to us today about the topic, or one of the topics in his dissertation, a hybrid theory of ethical thought and discourse. But before I welcome him up, I also want to note that the way that we run these talks at the Institute, if you haven't been to one before, is that we have a respondent. So Drew's going to speak for about a half hour, then we'll have a brief response. And our respondent today is another fellow, and this is how we do it. We have the fellows paired. Is Prakash Kashwan. Yeah, Prakash is a professor in the political science department. He's co-director of the research program on economic and social rights at the Human Rights Institute at the University of Connecticut. And he's the author, as many of you know, of the widely reviewed and acclaimed book, Democracy in the Woods, Environmental Conservation and Social Justice in India and Tanzania and Mexico. And that was from Oxford in 2017. But without further ado, I'm turning it over to Drew Johnson. Enjoy that.
Thank you, Michael. And I just want to say thanks for the opportunity to present my work here. I've already been discussing aspects of it with several of the other fellows, and so I want to acknowledge that I think the talk will have been very much improved by those interactions. So this is work that's based on work that I've done previously, but I'm also introducing some new material. So this is going to be a nice opportunity for me to sort of try this out and see how it goes. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking about entrenchment and disagreement in morality and politics, reason, passion, and the point of moral and political discourse. So I'd like for us to start by thinking about the following case. And so I'm just going to read through a bit of this here. So the COVID-19 patient's health was deteriorating quickly at a Michigan hospital, but he was having none of the doctor's diagnosis. Despite dangerously low oxygen levels, the unvaccinated man didn't think he was that sick and got so irate over a hospital policy forbidding his wife from being at his bedside that he threatened to walk out of the building. Dr. Matthew Trunsky didn't hold back in his response. "You're welcome to leave, but you'll be dead before you get to your car," he said. And so I think this should get us thinking a little bit about deep disagreement. I'm going to be interested in cases like these insofar as I find them interesting from an epistemological perspective, because this seems to involve a matter of life and death. And so there seems like there's little incentive for the patient to be insincere about what they believe in this case. So it seems that some people are genuine in their COVID denial. And so in this talk, one of the questions I want to consider is, well, how do we navigate disagreements about matters like these, and how should we navigate disagreements about matters like these? So here's the plan for the talk. I'm going to be considering the role of reason in navigating deep disagreements. And so in the first section, what I'm going to do is lay out some of the theoretical background for how I'm thinking about deep disagreement in morality and politics. Then in the second section, I'm going to consider some sources of skepticism for thinking that reason does have that role in our public discourse. And then in section 3, I'm going to provide an alternative to a certain rationalist picture of how we navigate these disagreements. And hopefully in discussion, we'll have some time to consider whether this picture provides a way forward for navigating deep disagreement. So just by way of sort of prelude here, in recent years, disagreement on moral and political matters seems to have become increasingly rampant and difficult to resolve. This trend might be viewed as one aspect of the recent information crisis characterized by a general increase in the spread of false and misleading information and the increasing resilience of this misinformation to correction. Part of what makes the information crisis so troubling, I think, particularly concerning moral and political topics, is that these are matters of public concern about which decisive actions sometimes need to be taken. So we sometimes have to take a position, at least for the purposes of setting policy, for instance, on moral issues such as abortion. When that happens, ideally, we would want our decisions to be based on the best evidence. Deep disagreement, I think, is troubling because it confounds attempts to arrive at a consensus based on the best evidence. So, as should be clear, I'm setting this project within a very broad question concerning the scope and the possibility of reason in navigating deep disagreement. And so for this purpose, I want to focus on a very narrow sort of disagreement that I think is particularly troubling if you want to think that reason has a role to play, right, in principle, right? So this is an in-principle challenge. So I'm going to be setting aside instances of deep disagreement that seem simply to be due to failures of rationality, although, as we'll see, there's a question about what rationality amounts to. I focus on instances of disagreement that persist even when interlocutors appear willing to follow the evidence where it leads. Right? And this sort of disagreement, I think, is particularly troubling if we want to think of reason as having a role to play in public discourse. So the kind of disagreement that's going to be of interest here is what I call mutually recognized propositional disagreement between good faith interlocutors. It's mutually recognized in that everyone realizes that there is a disagreement. Propositional in that the disagreement concerns whether some proposition or some belief or sentence, roughly, is true or false. And involving good faith interlocutors. So I see a good faith interlocutor as someone who at least makes the attempt to provide their genuine reasons for belief. That is, reasons to which their belief is causally sensitive. So if you were to successfully challenge their reason for belief, it would be rational for them to abandon that belief. I'm also going to be concerned with a certain kind of rational resolution to disagreement, a kind that I think is the target of a certain picture of public discourse. So here are some ways in which you might consider a disagreement to be rationally resolved. You might end a disagreement by agreeing to disagree. This can be practically rational. Say if you want to preserve a friendship with someone, but you just can't see eye to eye on some issue, you might find it rational to set that aside. There can also be a resolution of disagreement that occurs when you suspend your judgment about your initial view, or at least lower your confidence, either in response to the reasons that your interlocutor provides, or just out of mere recognition that you find yourself in a disagreement with someone else. That can be a reason to be somewhat skeptical of your initial view. However, I think that these two responses to disagreement can be they seem to be only the initial response, right? After you agree to disagree, you may still think that you're right and the other person could eventually be convinced. Once you suspend judgment or lower confidence in the face of a disagreement, you might still hope that eventually you'll be able to work out what the truth of the matter is. So I think these are temporary. The sort of rational resolution I'll be concerned with is what I'm going to call resolution towards a reasonable consensus. And so this occurs when all the parties to the debate, they exchange reasons with each other, and on the basis of the reasons and evidence that provide, they all agree that they all agree about what the thing to believe is, right? So they all come to a consensus on the basis of their shared reasons. So according to the rationalist picture that I want to criticize in this talk, achieving a reasonable consensus is one of the main goals of voicing disagreement in the first place and engaging in dialogue. I'd like to do some work to characterize this rationalist picture of disagreement. And so a good way to see the motivation behind this sort of picture, I think, is to consider one of John Stuart Mill's famous arguments for free expression. Mills argues against the silencing of any opinion on the grounds that, quote, if the opinion is right, we're deprived the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, we lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. According to the rationalist picture, one of the goals of public discourse, it seems, is to gain a better grasp of the truth by allowing us to survey the various reasons that people offer for contrary opinions, and then collectively deciding what those reasons best support taken together. That is a kind of a reasonable consensus. As just another quote to kind of motivate thinking that this might be a common assumption about what we're doing when we engage in disagreement, I'm just going to quote from this wonderful book, thanks to Shiloh for suggesting this to me, from Gordon Smith about reasonability. Right? So she writes, everywhere we look, we see the gospel that reasoned argument is the currency of persuasion, that the right way to change our minds is by entering into a sort of gladiatorial contest of ideas where we leave the personal behind. And so it's this sort of picture that I want to target in this talk. Now, I think this rationalist picture of disagreement may depend on a certain on some assumptions about what we're doing when we disagree. So I'd like to go over some of these assumptions here. So this is going to be part of my critique of this picture. According to this rationalist picture, part of the goal of voicing disagreement is that doing so allows us to achieve a reasonable consensus, one that might bring us closer to the truth by being based on the collective reasons that we provide for each other. And so here are three assumptions that I suspect the rationalist picture might be making, which can be challenged. So I just want to explain these a little bit. The first is this thesis, as it's known in the literature on social epistemology, labeled impermissivism, according to which, at most, one doxastic state, that is, a state of belief, or of doubt, or suspension of judgment, or being confident to a certain degree, an attitude that you have towards a proposition. At most, one of those can be made rational by the available evidence. So that is, it permits only one state to be rational, given the body of evidence. Closely related to this, I think, is the assumption of aperspectivalism, according to which your social position and other non-epistemic factors do not make a difference to which beliefs are made rational by the evidence available, nor do they make a difference to what evidence are in principle available to you in a given case. So I think that without either of these first two assumptions, it seems that it would be in principle possible that at the conclusion of a reasonable dialogue, interlocutors would continue to find it rational to believe what they did before they started the discussion. That is, it would be rational for them to continue to disagree. And so if we're to reach a reasonable consensus, if that's the point of voicing disagreement and engaging in public discourse, then it seems we have to assume that once our reasons have been exchanged, once we've concluded the debate, there will then just be one rational thing for us to believe or not, or to be confident in to such and such a degree. Finally, I view this rationalist picture of disagreement as endorsing a justificational principle, which holds that an agent's belief is rational only if it's warranted by evidence the agent has that's initially more certain than the belief it's supposed to rationalize. I think that this third assumption is important because it codifies a dialectical principle endorsed by the rationalist picture, which describes when and how evidence can contribute to a rational change in belief. So, right, you might think that in order to rationally persuade someone of something, you need to provide evidence that's initially more certain to them than the thing you're trying to persuade them of. Now, given that we're considering disagreements between good faith interlocutors, then it seems that the sorts of reasons you would be providing to your interlocutor should also be reasons for your belief that would be more certain to you than the belief that they are supposed to justify. And so that gives us this justification principle. Okay, so in the next section, then, I'm going to turn to criticize this rationalist picture by considering some reasons to be skeptical of its account of the role of reason in navigating disagreement. So first, I'm going to discuss how I'll be understanding deep disagreement and why it might be a problem to the rationalist picture. Deep disagreement, as I'm going to be working with the concept here, occurs when a good faith, mutually recognized propositional disagreement persists over time without easy resolution, owing to a difference between interlocutors in their fundamental epistemic principles or their fundamental intellectual commitments that cannot be defended without circularity. So for instance, you might consider disagreements over some disagreements in religious belief. We might expect some such disagreements to be instances of deep disagreement when they cannot be justified in a non-circular way, right? So if you appeal to the evidence of some, a text, right, a sacred text to justify your religious belief, that's not likely going to be able to convince someone in a non-circular way who didn't already accept what you're trying to convince them. Now, I want to note right at the outset here that it's probably going to be hard to tell in any given case whether we're dealing with genuine deep disagreement. This is because we're not always in a position to identify whether the disagreement is based on further principles or commitments that can't be defended in a non-circular way. But I'm going to take apparent persistence, right? So when a disagreement persists over time as some initial evidence that we may be dealing with a deep disagreement. Here's what would make deep disagreement a challenge for the rationalist picture. If the rationalist picture were correct, we would expect that any apparent disagreement would be, in principle, rationally resolvable towards a reasonable consensus, even if that doesn't happen in practice. This seems to fall out of the rationalist commitment to the idea of impermissivism and aprospectivism. So the thought would be that once interlocutors have shared their reasons, exchanged their reasons for belief, then there should just be one rational thing for them to believe or not. If that's the case, then the only explanation for a continued disagreement would seem to be that one of the interlocutors is being irrational or not treating the evidence as it should be treated. In which case, we're not really faced with an instance of deep disagreement after all. Now I'd like to pivot and discuss an explanation for why we might expect to find deep disagreement. That is an explanation of why certain beliefs, certain intellectual commitments may resist rational revision so that disagreements concerning them will persist and not be easily rationally resolved. So this idea of bad faith argument here, I'm going to understand as engaging in voicing a disagreement without providing one's genuine reasons for belief. And in general, bad faith argument isn't going to be a problem for the rationalist picture. Rationalists are presumably just going to rule those cases out as not involving good faith interlocutors in the first place, right? So this will be the case when it comes to, for instance, dialectical posers or people who are just plain devil's advocates or online trolls, right? These would be people who knowingly provide non-genuine reasons for some belief. And so that kind of disagreement, I said, I'm ruling out from the outset. I think the more troubling category comes when we consider what I'm going to be labeling here as post-hoc rationalization, which is going to occur when someone unknowingly provides a non-genuine reason for belief. So they're making an attempt to engage in good faith dialogue, right? But they don't really realize that the reasons they offer for their belief don't really aren't really causally responsible for the belief. So as a kind of example here, right, you might think about you may believe that, right, the Earth revolves around the sun. But if I were to ask you to justify that belief, right, you may offer some justifications, but you may not know exactly the relevant science to be able to fully justify your belief. Nevertheless, you hold on to that belief. Right? So if you were to engage in an argument about that, if you were to offer some scientific reasons, and yet those were refuted, it seems like your immediate reaction would not be to abandon your belief, but to think you might have made some mistake in your explanation. Given that this post hoc rationalization is unknowing or unintended, even good faith interlocutors can mistake their genuine reasons for belief. And so if that belief is held in place by influences that are insensitive to the reasons you offer, I think this would provide some initial evidence that the disagreement about that belief is going to be a deep disagreement, right? Because it doesn't seem like you're giving really reasons that are sensitive to the belief. So I think the widespread influence of certain cognitive biases and heuristics may help to explain such post hoc rationalization, in which case we may, in the end, engage in much less reasonable discourse than we think, at least when we're on the model of the rationalist picture. So here are some potential sources of post hoc rationalization: a variety of cognitive heuristics or biases, which can also be connected with the current information crisis. So for instance, we can consider the confirmation bias, which describes the tendency to seek out only information that supports a view that you already hold, or the conformity bias, which describes the tendency to believe what those around one believe. Or there's motivated reasoning, which occurs when one's gathering and assessment of evidence is supported by one's desire to reach a certain conclusion, rather than something the evidence best supports. Now, moral and political disagreement seems especially subject to deep disagreement, and so especially problematic for the rationalist picture. And two factors I think seem particularly salient here, although I think I only have time to very briefly touch on them. This has to do with the influence of emotionally driven intuitions on moral and political judgments, and the influence of social identity on one's moral and political beliefs. So very briefly then, what makes these more influential when it comes to moral and political judgment? Well, here I would hypothesize that it has to do with the distinctive function of moral and political judgment. So if we consider ordinary, non-moral, and non-political beliefs, many of these beliefs seem to have a purely descriptive function. So for instance, ordinary scientific beliefs seem to aim at describing how the world is. They do not themselves tell us how to act in light of those facts about how the world is. By contrast, basic moral and political thought and talk is action guided. They are value-laden realms. So they do directly concern how we ought to act or what policies to enact. And I think this is in part the purpose or the function of these domains, to guide our action by appeal to principles and values. However, and here I want to move very quickly, I think, in short, the very mechanisms by which moral and political discourse accomplish their function also seem to comprise non-epistemic influences on those beliefs, and so are capable of driving deep disagreement and undermining the purpose of public discourse, at least according to the rationalist picture. Right. So I have in mind here the influence, the connection between action guidance and our emotionally driven intuitions. So it seems like moral emotions, anger, right, moral anger, has a function in driving action. It gets us to act in response to perceived injustices. And so given this connection between these affective states and action, there seems to be an influence here which might drive post hoc rationalization, and so drive deep disagreement about moral issues. Now I want to turn to consider an alternative to the rationalist picture that I kind of started out with and that I've been critiquing throughout the video. So rather than taking the considerations just laid out as cause for skepticism about the role of reason in moral and political discourse generally, I think instead what these illustrate are the shortcomings of the rationalist picture. So what I'd like to do in this section then is briefly sketch an alternative to that picture, one that affirms these non-epistemic factors on moral and political belief actually as enabling knowledge rather than undermining. So I suggest that we take the apparent possibility of deep disagreement on moral and political matters at face value as manifesting the failure of the rationalist picture, as a description of how we conduct public discourse in moral and political domains. Instead, I would like to approach explaining deep disagreement on these matters from an alternative framework, one that views the influence of emotional dispositions as supporting knowledge, recognizes the socially situated character of knowledge generally, and explains why certain deep disagreements are indeed not directly rationally resolvable. And so I take inspiration here from Ludwig Wittgenstein's enigmatic masterpiece, Uncertainty, And so this alternative framework, which I'm going to be labeling situated hinge epistemology for reasons I hope become clear, I'm going to supply as an alternative to the rationalist picture. So a central passage in uncertainty, I think, confronts the rationalist picture in the following way. Wittgenstein writes, the questions we raise and our doubts depend on the fact that some propositions are exempt from doubt, as it were like the hinges on which they're turned. And just after, he continues, but it isn't, so it is not, that the situation is like this. We just can't investigate everything, and for that reason, we're forced to rest content with assumptions. Rather, I think, if I want the door to turn, the hinges must stay put. And so these passages have inspired a literature of so-called hinge epistemology, unified in maintaining that knowledge is only possible because certain of our intellectual commitments are held fixed, even though those commitments are not themselves justified. So I read Wittgenstein as suggesting that a belief can only be more or less certain than another in relation to some set of background commitments that are held fixed, exempt from doubt. So without such a background world picture, we would lack a frame of reference for making judgments about what's more certain or less certain than something else. So for this reason, someone who claims to doubt everything, so a radical skeptic who says there is no knowledge on this picture, doesn't really fully understand what it means to doubt or to believe in the first place. They don't really fully appreciate that concept. But one might be led to ask, what could justify such a maximally certain sort of core or hinge belief? And I think the answer we get from Wittgenstein is that, well, that question doesn't really make sense. It's a precondition of our practices of justification that something's held fixed without justification. Or consider, any proposed justification for a core belief will be less certain than the belief to be justified. And so it cannot be used as a justification for it. So we come to the conclusion that our core beliefs, the most fundamental beliefs, are actually, on the rationalist picture, turn out to be groundless. But this is not meant to be a vindication of skepticism. Rather, the idea is that our core beliefs are just not appropriate targets for doubt. So the skeptic relies upon the inappropriate requirement that these commitments themselves can be justified by further reasons. As Wittgenstein says, at the foundations of well-founded belief lies belief that is not founded. Crucially, for my purposes here, I also think, and I think this finds some support with Wittgenstein's uncertainty, that the core beliefs we have can vary across individuals and can shift over time. So as opposed to Descartes' kind of foundationalist picture, where we can ground everything on claims such as, I think, therefore I am. This is a much more contingent, socially based kind of picture of the foundations for our knowledge. So what makes a core belief into a core belief, then, is the role that it plays in the believer's worldview. And so following Wittgenstein, I think we might see these core commitments as held in place by our ways of life, by the practices and communities that we participate in. And if so, I think the core beliefs would turn out to be subject to the kinds of socialization pressures that as I was discussing before, seem to have an effect on our moral and political judgments. There may then be disagreements over core commitments. So now I think we should be able to see how this picture contrasts with the rationalist picture portrayed at the beginning of the talk. So the rejection of the justificational principle we just saw, right? There isn't really a justification for your most fundamental beliefs. There couldn't be any such thing. That's what it means to say that there are your core beliefs. Against impermissivism and aperspectivalism, if it's correct, as I've been urging, that our core beliefs can vary across individuals and can be shaped by non-epistemic factors, and given that these core beliefs play an important role in determining what counts as evidence for an individual, we come to have a rejection of these theses. And so I think the following picture then emerges of how we might analyze deep disagreement. So you can imagine two communities that have different sets of core beliefs in the background. And when those differences make a difference in a disagreement between members of these communities, no direct rational resolution will be possible. For the interlocutors will not be able to provide their genuine reasons for belief because the core beliefs in these situations are rationally groundless, right? So there's not going to be a further justifying reason. When it comes to deep disagreement, what this picture predicts is that persuasion by rational means will not be possible, at least not directly. For any reasons offered will be by hypothesis, less certain than the belief in question. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here just by leaving us with a couple of questions where we might take this. And so I have some thoughts about these, but I thought I'd pose these as maybe generating further discussion. So if not by rational resolution, we might wonder how ought we to approach and to navigate deep disagreement when there is a need for us to come to consensus. And if rational resolution towards a reasonable consensus is not the goal of public discourse, what is it that we're aiming for, and what should we be aiming for? So I think I'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much.
Now, response by Prakash.
Thank you, Drew, for this really engaging, deep, very thoughtful presentation and your work. And I've also had the pleasure of having multiple rounds of discussion, so I know that you think very deeply about these things. And what is especially satisfying to me, a political scientist with a dash of behavioral kind of training, is that we've been able to unpack some of the vocabulary and sort of underlying methodological approaches and all of that. So I've really enjoyed our discussions too. So before I give any of my own sort of comments, I just want to step back for a moment, and I want to state a big fundamental question that Drew is raising, which somehow got drowned a little bit in your very interesting presentation. And so I'm reading from the text that Drew has shared with me. And insofar as the rationalist picture captures the ideal of public discourse, one may wonder what value public discourse has if we cannot live up to it, even in principle. Right? So his project goes to the core of what it means to do public discourse, to engage in public debates and deliberations. And that, as you know, also goes to the heart of what it means to be a public, right? Because without public discourse and deliberations, there's no public. And so this project is, in that sense, is a fundamentally crucial for all of the major challenges that we can imagine in our time today. And as we all have been talking about repeatedly, we live in an age of crisis, multiple crises, and intersecting multiple crises, right? And so in that context, I think this is like absolutely fundamentally important, and Drew is sort of hitting the hammer on a nail, which is very, very central to how we anchor the project of humanity as such. So I learned a lot. And as you know, I'm not a psychologist, so I'll leave all of that to others who in the room who have a better handle on those kinds of questions. I want to open up two kinds of questions, and probably they are your postdoctoral projects. So don't worry about this project or even your doctoral work. One is sort of in Drew's text and presentation, you use the moral and political part of this conundrum in a sort of hyphenated way. And so moral and political always went together in your talk and discussion. And I've been thinking about this for a while now, because as you know, for almost 2 decades now, more than 2 decades actually, but at least for 2 decades, folks have been debating nonstop about the thing called climate change and climate crisis. And there's this community of people who have taken upon themselves the task of convincing the climate deniers. And you know what has happened in 20 years? Things have gotten worse. They haven't gotten better, right? And so there's something about political which is fundamentally different from moral, right? And those differences, I suspect, have a lot of interesting insights for your project, and you're on right track in terms of sort of methodological and other kinds of inclinations, and I think that will be a productive line to pursue. Second, related argument or line of questioning has to be in terms of thinking about the relationship between the rationalist and the core, the hinge and what is being hinged around, right? So I wonder if we have to find an alternative vocabulary rather than thinking of these two as alternatives to one another, right? We think of them as being different. And then that comes out in some of the quotes that you read out for us and then you engaged with. And that, the relationship between the rational and the moral and the political, and how to sort of navigate both theoretically and methodologically, the relationship between the core and the rational will reveal some of the potentials and pitfalls of connecting them or making them entirely separate, or thinking about the dialectic relationship between the two. So these are sort of the two main sort of thoughts I wanted to leave for some discussions, and maybe for follow-up discussions between us later on. But with that, I would like to congratulate again for your wonderful, insightful, deeply thoughtful project, and open it for Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Josh is going to moderate. He's going to take the questions. He's going to alternate between in this room and online.
Thank you. Okay, so thanks so much for the talk, Drew. I think this stuff is awesome. And I'm really interested in the things, like there's one question that picks up from sort of where you left off and where Prakash left off, and kind of where we left off when we were talking yesterday, which is like, what's really going on in public discourse then, right? Like if there's this thing that's happening where we tell ourselves the rationalist picture, that's what we say we're doing, but apparently that's not what is actually driving what's happening. What's actually going, so there's a descriptive question about that, like what's really going on. And I'm also interested in a sort of prescriptive question about it, like what should we be doing in public discourse? Does thinking in some way alternative to the rationalist picture give us some guidance about what we should be doing in public discourse, or what that might look like? So those are kind of big questions that sort of take off from where you left off. So if you have thoughts about them, I'm really curious. But I wanted to ask one question that's like specifically about what you're doing in this paper. So this is about hinge commitments. So, I wonder if what's really going on in some of these things that we're calling hinge commitments. So one version of the worry is that too kind of focused and cornerstone-y a picture, right? Is what's happening maybe more sort of holistic than that? Like not so much a hinge, cornerstone commitment, but more like a sort of constellation of things. Maybe none of which, and part of what sets me off on this is when you say, like the hinge commitment is the one that you're absolutely certain about. But I actually think part of what's going on is there might be a lot of things that you're not absolutely certain about, but all together they function as this sort of web that you're caught in and you can't move out of. But anyway, so one of the things that I think about that though too is I started to think, actually I wonder if a lot of what's going on is not so much here's this one commitment that you are so deeply epistemically attached to, but actually there are all these connections that you have, like perhaps to people, to a community, right? Perhaps these are affective investments, things about your own history that you're committed to continuing. I don't know, like, so, you know, because of my connection to a certain community, I can't like consider a different view about abortion. And I can't even consider that because like, to do that would be to sort of threaten my connections with my community, maybe to threaten the sort of aptness of lots of my affective commitments, like we engage in this practice of this weird macabre mourning for the unborn, and I'd have to give that up, and that would be weird, and that would make me rethink like what's going. I don't know, shunning people who disagree is something that I'd have to think, oh shoot, like maybe I was wrong to kick out so and so from my. I don't know, like there's a way in which there's a sort of constellation of things that you are attached to, not at this epistemic level. And that made me think about the thing that you did where you said the action guiding function. You were talking about that action guiding function of moral and political stuff and how that brings all these non-epistemic and sort of covert influences into the discourse. And I started to wonder, like, is that where the magic happens? Is that where the deep disagreement comes from? So that's a little journey that I went on.
Maybe one more question.
I love how you started with that COVID example, and I think your topic is really timely with Trump, and I think that when he announces to the masses, his masses, that the election was stolen, I think he's acting in completely bad faith, but a lot of people believed it in good faith, even though they're vigilantes. But anyway, what do you do with that? And the other thing is, I mean, it's particularly concerning. I was listening to a summary of a book on fascism, and they said one of the criteria, Trump fit all four criteria of fascism to a T, and one of them was evaluation of truth. And so how does your research, where does that get us? Does it get us anywhere in the Trump situation?
Great, thank you. I've got a lot of things to talk about here. Let me see if I can focus on a couple. So Carol, I think there was a question about this evaluation of truth as kind of a problem that comes with right fascist leaders. And I take it that there might be a worry in the background here that there might be a worry that in rejecting the rationalist picture, there also might be as well kind of downplaying the importance of truth. And so I think I want to, I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I think we can still value truth. But what I think the alternative to the rationalist picture gives us, and this is the question of what to do about, right, these good faith believers in, you know, that
And the bad faith truth teller.
right. So what do we do when we're engaging with these people if we value truth? Well, I think what this alternative tells us more so than what to do is maybe what won't work, right? So what's not going to work is maybe what the rationalist picture would prescribe, which would be, well, you engage in rational debate,
Right.
right? So that's something that I think is probably not going to be effective when confronted with this kind of problem of disagreement. So getting back to the truth, of course, everyone's going to be thinking that their view is truth, right? And I just want to emphasize that the alternative framework that I promoted kind of use epistemic frameworks as varying across individuals, but that's not yet to say that truth varies across individuals. So it's the difference between, it's not truth relativism, but I think it may be epistemic relativism. So I guess that's where I come down on that. I don't know if that's, you know, if that satisfies.
Well,
yeah.
How do you deal with the fact that a significant percentage of our country believes that the election was stolen? Like, how do you can't convince them with rational talk.
Yeah.
I mean, indict Trump, that might be a good start in my view, but what, I don't know, philosophically, what do you do with those people?
I mean, this is something that I've thought about in some other work that I've done, and I'm starting to grow a bit more skeptical about this. But it seems like, you know, if it's right that our core beliefs are held in place in part by our ways of life and, you know, the communities we participate in, well, that does suggest that one way to get across these sorts of disagreements is to build community with people that you disagree with. Right, so if you start to share ways of life, you start to pick up on things like, oh, this person doesn't think whatever it is.
Right.
And it might be something that you just kind of have always assumed was the case based on how you were raised. Right, so as we confront other people and start to build communities with them, we start to maybe question some of these things. That might be one avenue. I'm growing a little skeptical about this. One reason why is I don't want the prescription to be that we should go out and, make friends with, white nationalists.
But maybe you're hitting on something, because if it's the identity groups, like the Lincoln Project, conservatives saying we're part of your people and we think he's crazy, maybe that's it.
Right.
Because they formed a belief system because of their social groups. Sorry for that.
No, that's really helpful. So now I think, I can speak to some of your comments as well. I think starting from one of the later questions about this question about whether the sort of hinge or core beliefs that I'm talking about are a little too cornerstone-y, rather than more like a constellation. This is something I'd like to think more about, but I'm wondering if those two ideas are really opposed. Whether it might not be the case that there are, say, a constellation of interrelated propositions, but that are held collectively in this cornerstone way. And so what got me thinking about this was, the way that you were presenting the example made me think of questions like, oh, if I'm wrong about this, then, and then something else is wrong. Right? So if I think that I have two hands. If I'm wrong about that, what can I do? Right? And that kind of thing points to this constellation picture. That if I could be wrong about this, I would also be wrong about all these other things that I have to take for granted. Right? So this goes against I'm not sure that anyone can really live a true radical skepticism. Right? You have to believe certain things in order to navigate the world. And so if you come to doubt some proposition, that seems like it's going to plunge the rest of it all. So that's kind of a cornerstone idea, but I think it's also kind of a constellation. So I'm not sure what you think about that.
A couple of questions.
Yeah, so following off of what Kyla was arguing before, I was wondering about the role of trust in all of this. So in the example that you gave earlier with the doctor, so this was going on early on in the pandemic with a lot of people where they just didn't trust the doctors knew what they were doing when it came to and then if doctors were being transparent, they really didn't know what they were doing, right? Because it was a new disease and there was so much misinformation out there about it, and then there were so many things that they were still learning. So a lot of the early on policies were just wrong. And now there's a lot of, this is going on with vaccines, and neighbors that I have don't want to get vaccinated because they think that they can't trust the vaccines themselves because of things like there have been experimentations on certain people with vaccines and other things. So a lot of that comes up, and I also wonder if it's the way the healthcare system is set up so that you don't really have one doctor that you always go to. It's so scattered all over the place, and there isn't the community thing that you were talking about has a lot to do with this. And then the other place where I was wondering about the role of trust is in methods. So early on when you're talking about epistemic frameworks, so if you're at something like when Peirce talks about different methods of settling belief, science is one of them, right? And then there's the method of authority, and then there's philosophy, and then there's other things you can do to settle belief. And if, can we even have debates about that? So Peirce, for example, says science is the best way to settle belief, but if you don't really trust science, then where do you go? So it's, sorry, all those questions.
That's, so I think I want to think more about how trust figures into this picture. I guess one thing that comes out that your question just raises for me is that when it comes to trust, I guess, we can say that we trust people, and that's a little bit different
Right.
from believing the proposition.
Right,
And I
yeah.
think that's interesting because that gets to this question of, in a way, like the connection to community.
Right.
Rely on.
Yeah, even as scientists, so like doctors, scientists, they're figures of authority in one way or another. So when they're telling you that vaccines are good for you and the climate change is happening, all of these things, then you can't really understand the science behind all of these things. So at some point you have to start making decisions about people to trust.
Yeah.
And I wonder what role that plays in all of this.
Yeah, I think that's also part of Wittgenstein's picture as well. So in Passages in Uncertainty, he talks about how children learn in school, right? It's not that you prove, right? That at least not at a certain stage, you don't prove that the earth goes around the sun. Rather, it's just something that the child has to be told, and that it kind of swallows down the rest of the education.
Yeah.
That's what phrases Wittgenstein uses, that swallow down the proposition.
Right, that's fascinating.
So we have one more question and one more online question. So I just wanted to use the prerogative of the moderator and introduce one other sort of idea here. And that was originally when I talked about the distinction between morality and politics. One role of politics, as in public sphere, right? Politics not just as ideology, which is inside our head, but one role of political process is to grapple with these challenges. And so in that sense, we have to think about political process as being separate from the cognition as political ideology. Second, we have to be active. So this is my radical interdisciplinary persona. Certain questions you cannot handle without dealing, sort of dipping into another discipline. So the fact that certain people can take mistruth and marshal it towards political goals, that has to be dealt with in the political, there's institutions, there's regulations, and all kinds of stuff, right? Vaccines, climate change, all of that comes to that picture. The third and very quick idea is of uncertainty. So the leap from the deep certainty of science and the deep uncertainty or deep mushiness of the moral cause, there are other stuff in between, right? So there's scientific ways of handling and thinking about uncertainty. And again, that's where public deliberations come into picture, because we can all talk about things that we don't know about, that we need to know about. But that doesn't mean that we are then sort of, jumping into sort of mythology, right? So there are lots of gray areas that need to be dealt with as gray areas. So again, I think this notion of alternatives, we need to think more about the relationship between different types of knowledges, lack of knowledge, and so forth. So that's just a long comment. We'll go to Elizabeth and then the online question.
So I have a question about community that sort of comes at this a slightly different way. And this is mostly me being curious, which was, I'm curious whether you think that this idea of hinge commitments functions only on an individual level, or if it can also function on the level of sort of a community or a society. And I'm thinking, the thing that I was thinking about when you were explaining this was the bit in Democracy in America where Alexis de Tocqueville says that democracy is able to flourish in the United States because there are things that nobody questions. And he's talking about religion, right? He says like religion is this thing that makes it possible to have incredibly virulent political debate because we all agree about this other stuff. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how hinge commitments function sort of on a social level.
Right. Good. Yeah. I mean, it's a question of whether these commitments operate at the level of the individual or at the level of the community.
Yeah.
I think the answer is yes. Right. So I guess, I kind of see it as interrelated, that the sort of core commitments you're likely to have as an individual, I think, are going to be, to a large extent, informed by what's considered common knowledge in your community.
Right.
Right. And so that gets back to this question about education. What do you learn? What's taken for granted? What do you swallow down along with everything else? I think is to a large extent a question. And so that's an interesting point you raised that I want to think about more in terms of what that means for democracy and whether, if it's the case that for democracy to function, there has to be some common ground well, that I think might be something that's under threat. Right. Because the kind of deep disagreements we're seeing, as I've characterized them, those would be disagreements where there's not enough overlap in core belief. Right. And so I think that might be a real problem.
Public norms. The online question.
So there's both a comment and a question. The comment is going back to Nimra's question, and it's from Lewis Gordon. He points out that the origin of the English word truth means trustworthy. There's a form of performative contradiction in going to a physician while not trusting her or his diagnosis. And then the question comes from Michael Fremer. Can breaking people out of their echo chambers and exposing them to the other through perspective taking lead them to question their core beliefs and values without them first having a certain openness or critical awareness beforehand?
That's a really interesting question. So I think there is a question of, so I've kind of portrayed these interconnectedness in such a way that it seems like they're really kind of locked, into place in a certain sense they are. And so that might leave the question of, well, how are we to, that places us the question of how to navigate deep disagreements. And I think what this question is making me think of is that, well, there can be more and less responsible ways of managing deep disagreements. And so it might not just be a matter of what your core commitments are, but what your sort of relation to those commitments are as well. So you might think that someone might be completely self-satisfied with their kind of belief system, as it were, not really open or interested in considering revisions. Compare that to someone who is open to considering revisions to even their fundamental belief system. That doesn't mean that they don't have core beliefs anymore. I think it just means it's a different relation to those core beliefs. So I think this gets to questions of, well, intellectual virtues, like open-mindedness versus closed-mindedness, right? Humility versus arrogance. So this is something that I've thought about. Yeah, so I think that's really important to consider. Just because we have different core beliefs doesn't mean that we're entirely epistemic equals, because we might have different relations to those.
All right, well, join me in thanking both Drew and